Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Nebula. This review will contain spoilers. Time to cue up the Green Day Graduation song, because, for the time being at least, it looks like Sony's Spider-Man villain universe has drawn to a close. With Kraven the Hunter, it seems Sony is winding down the SSU or the SPUMC or whatever other name we want to use that never really caught on. And look, I just did 2 videos about Venom 3 and the implications of it for Sony, and I wasn't super eager to jump back into this pool, but the fact is, I have been there to talk about every single one of these movies right after their release, so how could I miss out on what may very well be the final entry? Even if I may sound a little off this week because I am recording from a hotel this time around. If you can move past that, settle in, and let's talk Kraven, a character that, unlike Morbius or Madam Web, I've always had a real soft spot for. If you like my videos, you can help me get to 700k subscribers by the end of the year by hitting that subscribe button and that bell. In 2017, I really never thought I would still be doing this so many years later. So sincerely, thank you to everyone who has subscribed over the years.
I have come all this way for one purpose, to take you home.
Kraven the Hunter. If you're familiar with this character from old comic books, recent comic books, cartoons, video games, whatever, toss it in the trash, that's barely gonna help you here. This movie goes in its own strange direction. After his mother's death, Sergei Kravenov and his brother Dmitri are pulled into their father Nikolai's criminal empire. Mortally wounded on a hunting trip, Sergei is saved by a young woman named Calypso who uses her mysterious family serum, which grants him special and vaguely defined animal powers. Disgusted by his father, Sergei flees to the great outdoors and adopts the name Kraven. He then starts targeting rich crime lords and gangsters. Pretty soon he's at odds with the Rhino, who looks just terrible, and his own dad. So that's the basic outline of the movie. What that leaves out though, what a simple plot description can't capture, is that special Sony secret sauce. You know what I mean, where all these Spidey villain movies just have to feel like they're held together by poorly done ADR, 3 sticks of bubblegum, and a prayer. I think Kraven flows a little better than Madam Web and Morbius for some of its runtime, but then just falls back into the same old traps. The best example of this is probably the character of Calypso, played by Ariana DeBose, who I really liked in Spielberg's West Side Story, and is stuck with an absolutely baffling character here. It basically goes without saying that she bears almost no resemblance to the character from the comics, but what's more is that she's also just so ill-defined as to be almost laughable here. A straightforward way to describe her character in this movie would be to say that she's a high-powered lawyer, an expert archer, with a family that makes magic potions that can raise people from the dead. If that sounds like it could be a little scattered and all over the place, don't worry, because the movie weaves each of these narrative threads into just a few clunky scenes. Like the exposition for her skill with a bow is just jammed into a scene with ADR. That is, replacing dialogue with newly recorded lines after the fact. ADR itself is not a bad thing, of course, it's a great tool for filmmakers and often necessary, but Kraven is unsurprisingly terrible at using it in a way that isn't horribly obvious. There's a scene near the end of the film where Calypso saves Kraven at the last minute by taking out one of the strongest villains with her bow. That is the only reason that stray line about her love of archery exists, to set up this incredibly forced moment that doesn't feel in line with the rest of what we've seen from this character at all. Imagine, just for a second, if one of the university set scenes in Raiders of the Lost Ark dubbed in an awkward line, where Marcus Brody just casually comments that he's competing in the highest level of marksmanship competitions on the weekends, just so that he can show up blasting and blow Belloc away at the end of the 3rd act. That's basically what this movie does, and it is just as clumsy as it sounds. Also, I think she just disappears from the movie after this. It's all just so poorly assembled, and I continue to be astounded that the studios think so little of the audience that they have no issue releasing films in this state over and over again. But to cut them some slack and say something that I say about way too many bad movies, I do think there were some promising elements here. The opening prison assassination is probably the high point of the film, promising a kind of good old-fashioned 80s action movie setup that most of the rest of the film fails to deliver on. I did enjoy when Kraven was being hunted in the woods and things momentarily turned into a fairly graphic riff on First Blood, even if computer-generated blood splatter just continues to be way lamer than squibs. On a character level, while the first act of the film, after the prison break opening, drags on way too long, I did kinda like the dynamics at play here. Russell Crowe, as Kraven's domineering drug lord father, is well cast. He's an intimidating presence, and I think he turns in a solid performance with what he has here. The thing is, I think the concept is actually much stronger than what's on the page. Now, I'm not saying there was anything revolutionary going on here, but the idea of this aging crime boss trying to gauge his two sons to see who can continue his brutal legacy is a familiar setup for a reason, because it works. It's a scenario that's really ripe for drama and intrigue, especially in the hands of an actor who exudes gravitas as naturally as Crowe. But the movie is unable to take advantage of that because it's very workmanlike direction and its underwhelming script. Early on, the young brothers are forced to go on a big game hunting trip right after the death of their mother. Crowe's character wants to see what they're made of, if they're up for the kind of brutal, no-mercy mindset that would be required to follow in his footsteps. And it was during these scenes that I couldn't help but think of the HBO show Succession, where media mogul Logan Roy is often seen playing mind games with his kids like this, testing them, mocking them, emasculating them, and just generally being a scary hard ass. Many of those scenes are riveting. It's edge-of-your-seat stuff as these hapless adult children try desperately to either win his favor or push back on him and assert their own independence. But those conversations are written with a lot of skill, a keen ear for dialogue and subtext between characters who rarely wear their true feelings on their sleeves. Kraven takes a different approach, generally just having characters shout everything that they think and feel at each other, like when Crowe yells, "Be a man!" at his son in just a really quick aside. Like, I'm not asking for King Lear, but some level of nuance would have gone a long way here. Some real sense of texture and weight to these relationships beyond their mechanical functions to drive the plot forward. The entire movie culminates in a scene where Kraven has one last conversation with his father. If they had landed this moment, if that relationship had meant something, if their scenes together were better written and directed with a greater sense of purpose, and the whole movie came down to a well-executed version of that scene, I'd be willing to forgive a lot of the rest of the faults with it. In my mind, the film hinges on that relationship. And despite the best efforts of Crowe and the more uneven Aaron Taylor Johnson, I just don't think it does. There's an implication at the end of the film that Kraven is much more like his father than he'd like to admit, and that should be devastating. Like, on paper, I really like it. Both brothers hated this man and wanted nothing to do with carrying on his legacy. Yet one literally takes over his criminal enterprise, and the other is just as much of a cold, merciless killer as he was. This seems like it should be sad and potentially really emotional. The thing is, though, that all gets buried under the shoddy writing and the usual terrible Sony shtick. Oh, his brother is actually the chameleon now! He had an off-screen medical operation. And look, Kraven is putting on his iconic vest, just like the comics, it's the vest! He loves the evil vest now! It takes what could have been a good ending and turns it into the usual franchise movie garbage. There is a lot of good ideas buried in here, like, I really do think that, but they can't survive Sony's never-ending appetite for tossing out half-baked sequel setups. So, finally, let's take a step back and talk about the haphazard foundation that Kraven the Hunter was built on from the very beginning. At the start of this whole enterprise, Sony seemed to decide that their Spider-Man villain movies would not feature those characters actually being villains. This is pretty understandable for Venom, who has secured more of an anti-hero place for himself at Marvel over the decades, but for Morbius and Kraven, it was a strange choice, even more so in a post-Joker world where we've seen a movie about a comic book villain just be so successful. Now, granted, I don't think there's any universe where a Kraven the Hunter movie is a bigger hit than that first Joker, but at least if these movies were unapologetically about Spider-Man bad guys being bad guys, there would have at least been an angle here. Not much, but at least something unique to prevent these movies from just feeling like store-brand MCU, at a time when the actual MCU isn't even doing that well. And yet movie after movie has stuck to this formula, giving us warmed-over superheroics in movies that feel so terrified of making any creative choices that break from the superhero movie norm that they're constant post-production second-guessing, and the weirdly edited films that emerge from that process become the most interesting thing about them. That lack of a post-credit scene in Kraven feels like a studio waving the white flag. Maybe they finally get it. Maybe this really is the end of the line for the Sony villain movies. I won't be sad to see them go, but I will always be fascinated by how they turned out this way. Kraven is the exact kind of big budget movie we've gotten a lot of during the years. If you're looking for something with a more independent feel and the personal touch of a creator you may be a fan of, I'm happy to say that none other than Patrick H. Willems has a new short film coming to Nebula featuring Severance's Zach Cherry and the Tick's Griffin Newman, among some other great faces you'll probably recognize. It's been really amazing to see Nebula continue to grow like this and include work from all sorts of creators, making new fiction and non-fiction possible. For those unaware, Nebula is a boutique streaming service where you can watch all my videos, plus a few exclusive ones, totally ad-free. Not to mention ones by Tierzu, Nando V Movies, Lindsay Ellis. They're all there alongside many others, encompassing a lot of genres of video. So don't miss it. Get a yearly Nebula subscription at go.nebula.tv/Captain Midnight right now. Plus, for those of you that want to share everything Nebula has to offer with your friends and family, Nebula is now offering annual gift cards. Use the link gift.nebula.tv/Captain Midnight to give a year of Nebula to a friend for just $36. You can find both of those links in the description down below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.